Hello everybody. Today I can prove triangles are isosceles by using CPCTC to show that two sides or angles are congruent. We know what an isosceles triangle is at this point, hopefully, ideally. An isosceles triangle has two congruent sides. So if the triangle has two congruent sides, it's isosceles. An isosceles triangle also has two congruent angles. So if it has two congruent angles, then it's isosceles. So my goal in order to prove a triangle is isosceles is to either have two congruent sides or two congruent angles. To get those two congruent sides or two congruent angles, I'm going to have to use CPCTC after the triangles are congruent. Remember, we're always proving triangles are congruent first. Once we prove they're congruent, then we can do what we need to do. So this is the mini proof version of proving triangles are isosceles. In the later lesson, the using CPCTC lesson, that's when you'll get the full proofs. So here I'm going to give you that the triangles are congruent, but again, in a full proof, you're going to have to prove the triangles are congruent, which you should have mastered at this point. So if these triangles are congruent, the blue and the green, I ultimately want to prove that this purple triangle is isosceles. So, do any of the corresponding sides or angles of the blue and the green triangle make the purple isosceles? The answer is yes. Okay, if these triangles are congruent, then these sides must be congruent by CPCTC. And if those sides are congruent, look, now this purple triangle has two congruent sides and must be isosceles. So I can say, since those triangles are congruent, that AB is congruent to AC, CPCTC, and now that those sides are congruent, triangle BAC is isosceles. Reason is an isosceles triangle. Has two congruent sides. If you use CPCTC to state that sides are congruent, then say an isosceles triangle has two congruent sides. If you use CPCTC to state that two angles are congruent, then say an isosceles triangle has two congruent angles. So let's do one more. Let's go number 2, statements. Reasons. I've got triangle ADM. I've got triangle BEM. Again, this is a mini proof version of this. In a full proof, you're going to have to first prove those triangles are congruent. And of course, I give you givens and whatnot in order to do that. So ultimately, I want this purple triangle to be isosceles, which means I need two congruent sides or angles to be congruent. So how are those blue and green triangles going to help me? Well, there's no sides of those blue or green triangles that's a side of the purple triangle, but there are angles. This angle and this angle are corresponding angles of the blue and the green triangles, and if those two angles are congruent, that makes the purple triangle isosceles. So to prove isosceles, it might be two congruent sides, it might be two congruent angles, depending on the information you have. So since those triangles are congruent, I can state that angle DAM is congruent to angle EBM. And the reason that those angles are congruent is CPCTC. Those triangles are congruent, therefore those angles must be congruent. And once those angles are congruent, it makes the purple triangle isosceles. So I can state that triangle ACB is isosceles. And the reason an isosceles triangle has two congruent angles. In this case, I use CPCTC to state angles, so I'm going to say it has two congruent angles. In the last example, I said it had two congruent sides, because I marked two congruent sides. So you're always proving triangles are congruent. To prove isosceles, we have to use CPCTC to state that either corresponding sides of those triangles or angles of those triangles are congruent, making the big triangle isosceles. And once we have those corresponding angles or corresponding sides, we can then state that it's isosceles because an isosceles triangle has either two congruent sides or two congruent angles. Practice it. See ya.